Good afternoon. Our next session is on cheap access to space. Cheap access is has been and is going to become a major strategic priority for the Space Frontier Foundation. The foundation led the public campaign in the 1990s for cheap access to space when the heyday of the X-33 and the X-37 and military spaceplane and DCX. The history is that the foundation actually cut the deal to save the DCX program by moving it over from SDIO to NASA, cut a deal with Dan Golden, made a strategic choice of instead of attacking the space station, the deal with Dan Golden, if you save DCX and keep it flying, the foundation would stop trying to kill the space station. For some period of years, cheap access became the #1 strategic space policy priority in this community. The history of this, though, is that there is many failures of attempts at cheap access from the original shuttle. It worked operationally but failed, to the NAS program in the 80s, spent several $billion and was many billions of dollars and 6 miracle technologies away from succeeding. Then to the X-33 program with VentureStar failed. And then there was actually a 4th attempt that in the mid-00s was an attempt to put together a big, huge government initiative, and it collapsed to instead they did the Vision for Space Exploration. So we have a panel of experts on cheap access to space here that represents both civil experts as well as commercial experts, and a candidate for U.S. Congress from the 8th District of Florida who has some policy expertise and thinking in this area. Today, I want to briefly introduce each of the of our panelists. We're going to have a short briefing from each of them, remarks, and then we're going to have a conversation among the group. Our first panelist, so I'm going to go actually, I'll do Jeff last. So our Gabriel Rothblatt from the 8th District of Florida. He's a candidate, he's a Democratic candidate running against Congressman Bill Posey, and he represents the nation's premier launch site, and we'll get his thoughts and thinking. Dr. Dan Rasky here, he's the director of the Space Portal and the Emerging Space Office at NASA Ames, and has worked on various cheap access to space initiatives. He's a national expert in thermal protection systems, and so that was many programs and activities. He's contributed expertise in that. He's been acknowledged of helping out SpaceX with their TPS, and has several objects, I think, in the Air and Space Museum and Smithsonian that he's worked on. To his right is Sean Mahoney, CEO of Maston Space Systems. Maston is one of the 3 winners of the Phase 1 DARPA XS-1 contracts that just got announced a few weeks ago. And if you don't, the XS-1 program from DARPA is a concept of 10-10-10, which is Mach 10 times 10 days, at least once to Mach 10. And they're starting, the first Phase 1 is study contracts. Northrop, Boeing, and Maston were the prime winners. Also Virgin Galactic, X-Corps, and Blue Origins are participating team members too. And we're going to hear from Sean about Maston's thinking and his ideas about cheap access to space as well. And then to Sean's right, we have Jeff Lane, who's the program manager at Northrop Grumman's XS-1 program. And Jeff has 30 years experience, and his background, for those of you, some of you were there, he was on the DCX program at McDonnell Douglas, and has deep expertise in hypersonics and reusable launch vehicles, and now is managing Northrop's development project for XS-1. And so we're going to first have Jeff up to share some thoughts and go through them, and then we'll have a conversation. Jeff Lane.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Aaron, for the invitation to speak today. So if we could cue up the disc. The title of the presentation is Cheap Access to Space, the Past, Present, and Future, packed into about 10 minutes, as I promised to keep it short. Next chart, please. The history is certainly a matter of perspective. Actually, you went one too far here. Let's go back. Okay. This particular vehicle is actually a vehicle that was developed by Phil Bono as a part of the NASA Saturn derivative studies, and is kind of the starting point that I chose for talking about the past relative to reusable space. This is the Ithacus vehicle, essentially a derivative of a single-stage to orbit vehicle. This particular vehicle was antipodal range vehicle to reach anywhere in the world with a single stage. And the reason I bring this up is basically in the early 90s, SDIO came out with a requirement as part of the SDI program to put up a whole myriad of satellites called Brilliant Pebbles and Brilliant Eyes, and they needed a low-cost method of getting those satellites into orbit. We're talking hundreds of satellites. So McDonnell Douglas went back and essentially dug up the material associated with this vehicle. But there was a major problem in one of the requirements of that is that the vehicle needed to have a high cross range. The Air Force wanted a once-around capability flying south out of Vandenberg. This particular vehicle, L over D, is very low, on the order of 0.3, and has very low cross range capability. Well, it turns out in the late 70s, early 80s, actually another program that I was fortunate to be a part of called AMARV, Advanced Maneuvering Reentry Vehicle. We were testing this in the late 70s, early 80s to essentially demonstrate the ability to be able to have a vehicle that could evade an adversary's ballistic missile defense system. And through flight test, we're able to demonstrate extreme high L over Ds, and in fact, L over Ds high enough to essentially provide the cross range that was necessary. So McDonnell Douglas's answer to addressing the SDIO problem was a vertical takeoff, vertical landing, nose first reentry called the DC-1. And as a part of that program, McDonnell Douglas proposed a ground test demonstrator to actually produce a flight vehicle to demonstrate that you could operate in subscale a liquid hydrogen rocket-powered vehicle in a reusable manner and operate it in a fully reusable manner and operate it very routinely. And you can't really talk about the DCX program without talking about Bill Galbat's, certainly his legacy in terms of promoting reusable space has been very important to pushing the industry forward. And unfortunately, he passed away a couple of weeks ago. Former boss of mine, certainly a visionary, but his legacy fortunately lives on. Okay, so one of the big bottlenecks we have, certainly in many of the activities that I've witnessed in presentations, is being able to utilize space. And one of the big bottlenecks, of course, in being able to utilize space is the fact that it's so expensive to get there. So what DARPA has done is they have conceived of a program in the same vein as the Delta Clipper to produce a highly reusable system, this time a two-stage system, and demonstrate that you can very efficiently operate a rocket-powered vehicle, airline-like operations, something you often hear, and marry the reusability in a high-performance vehicle and demonstrate that you can turn it around quickly. Okay, so what technologies are required to be able to implement such a vehicle? Well, You certainly need to be able to fly the booster autonomously in an unmanned fashion. You need precision, guidance, navigation, and control. Being able to land on a carrier certainly doesn't hurt. You need to be able to fabricate and operate reusable spaceplane airframes and integrate the proper propulsion systems. You need very highly efficient cryogenic propellant tanks, such as composite common bulkhead sandwich tanks. You need very high thrust-to-weight propulsion, and there's a lot of good solutions out there. And then, of course, you need very efficient, low footprint, low manpower mission management capability. Okay, so you've got this two-stage system. You want to be able to reuse the booster. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to implement what we call RTLS, return to launch site, for the booster? Well, there's actually many good ways, and most of these methods are in the context of a winged vehicle. Certainly there's an equal number likely for a vertical lander. The first one is actually cheats a little bit, downrange with a ferry. I suspect this is what SpaceX has planned for their Falcon 9 first stage. I don't know, that's purely speculation, but essentially you let the booster re-enter downrange, and then you ferry it back. If SpaceX is using a barge, maybe I can talk them into making it a little longer, and we can land a vehicle. Horizontal landing vehicle. Okay, second method, glide back. Essentially, upon engine shutdown at staging, you essentially glide the vehicle back to base. The unfortunate thing about this method is that you end up at a very low staging Mach number, and you end up putting a lot of the pressure on the upper stage in terms of completing the mission. Another method being investigated by the Air Force Research Lab is a method called rocket back, where you essentially, post-staging, use some remaining propellant to operate the engines and push the vehicle back to the launch site. There's variations on that. One, boost back. You re-enter downrange and turn the vehicle aerodynamically and boost back. And maybe I think one of our other competitors' favorites is utilizing a jet back. When you re-enter, pop out some rotating machinery and use jet power to cruise back to launch site. Okay, so what's an example of what an RTLS booster maneuver might look like? This one is the rocket back, and you can imagine point number one is the vehicle's at its staging point. Okay. So from there, the upper stage goes onto orbit, and now, we turn the vehicle around, and essentially using main engine propulsion, try to drive the vehicle back in the opposite direction, kill the downrange velocity, and generate an attitude back towards the launch site. So now we've generated enough energy altitude to get back to the launch site. We rotate the vehicle, shut the engines down, and then set yourself up for landing. Now, at this point, you've got enough energy to get back to the launch site, but you're in a little bit of a precarious position because your vehicle is well above its equilibrium glide altitude, so it essentially falls like a rock. And that's one of the key things you have to manage in this type of maneuver is essentially the pull-up once you hit the denser atmosphere. Get a little bit of a fugoid back to base and back to the launch site. So as far as the XS-1 program goes and pushing reusable launch vehicles further, many good ways to get there, whether your technique is vertical or horizontal landing, your favorite propellant is hydrogen or RP, or your tanks are metallic or composite, all good solutions. So the need is there. We think the technology is ready. So let's go do it. And that's all I've got.
Hey, Sean.
There we go. So Jeff did a great job of introducing the challenges of the history in reusable and the approach, at least some of the approaches that might work for XS1. Didn't bring any charts and I didn't work DCX. Members of our team did. What I did want to do is take a minute or two just to talk about this topic of cheap access or lower cost access, and then there's a lot of questions over what is Mastin doing for XS1, and the answer is I'm not going to tell you because we haven't finished phase 1 yet. So that's part of what the job of phase 1 is. We're going to look at and study and make decisions on how we would approach this particular problem. Mastin, if you think about the history of what the company has done. We've stood on the shoulders of the DCX program and have created a platform that is fully reusable. And when you look at the challenge of reducing the cost of access to space, one of the big things is that airplane-like operations. It's the ability to turn something very quickly. And I was trying to find something that would needle the rest of the panel. One of the things that airplane-like operations has is a small team. So Mastin operates our vehicles today, and granted they are not nearly the size that are necessary for accomplishing the XS1 mission, but we run with a very small team. And one of the ways to reduce the price of access to space is to employ fewer people. And so that is something that is sometimes against the grain of we have so many great trained people in the industry, but in order to reduce the cost of launch, we have to be able to operate with fewer people. So that's one of the things, obviously the reusability aspect of being able to use that same airframe. And I don't think there's anyone in the room that's not familiar with the idea of shuttle as refurbishable versus reusable. This is not going to be a simple thing to make a vehicle that can turn and fly 10 times in 10 days. You don't get the option to refurbish the vehicle if you have to fly 10 times in 10 days. And that's one of the things that Mastin's going to draw on our experience of being able to do those quick turns and leverage that to answer this hard problem of how do you create a vehicle that can actually turn that fast.
All right, Dan.
Hello, is this live? I also have a couple slides if you can put those up, and I'll do this from here also. And first to the proposition, should cheap access to space be a American priority? I say a resounding yes. I think this is something that, again, we have been struggling with really since the shuttle program, since the 70s. So it's been a long, slow road, but hopefully we're getting there. And I want to show what is one possible route. And if you go to the next slide, please. And this is from my friends down at SpaceX. And there's a video here, hopefully that we can run that. Can you click the video in the... Come on, video. Go video. But the video is of the recorded reentry burns for the Falcon 9 on the last launch. There we go. So here, it's just had the its second stage away. It does its first burn to slow down the stage. It's very high altitude and moving very quickly. And SpaceX had to struggle through a lot of torn up first stages before they figured out how do we get this thing down safely. And at one point they were finding at peak heating or peak dynamic pressure, the engines were actually ripping off the stage. That's how much pressure, that's how much dynamic pressure they had. So they do that high altitude burn. Then when they get closer, they do another burn. Unfortunately, their window iced up. They're going to fix that next time. But now they're close to the ocean surface. You'll see the legs deploy. There go the legs, the landing legs. They're still above the ocean. You'll see the plume form. That's where they get close enough to the ocean, the plume to form. And then you see the water come over the legs. So now it's sitting straight up, and then it tips over. And when it tips over, things don't go so well. But the intent is to keep it straight up. And I know one thing that they really want to do is land it back in Florida. And, and again, as both Jeff and Sean were mentioning, quick turnaround is the way that you get low cost of space. Now, in addition to quick turnaround, you need a reason to get to space often. Okay, that's the payload side, and there's a lot of people who have missed that. So, in addition to having the ability to get to space often, you have to have a reason to get to space often. If you put those two together, I think you really can drive the cost down. The exciting thing right now, after all these long decades of chasing this problem, is that we're really in the era of what I'd call experimentation. And if you look at other industries, cell phones, for example, you hit a point where there's a lot of different models being tried, a lot of different options being pursued, and then you'll find there'll be dominant designs that work the best. And those become the iPhones and the Androids, okay, that dominate the market. And we really haven't had this period of experimentation, in all honesty, with our space access, because it was the purview of large government programs for a long time. We really didn't have the experimentation. And now I think we're finally getting to the experimentation phase. I think the DARPA program is a great example of, okay, here's another route that we can pursue. And hopefully with the creative talents of companies such as Maston, that we'll see, this nut cracked. But we also need the payloads, so don't lose sight of the reason to go. Thank you.
All right. Gabriel, please, your thoughts.
I'll take the podium. Thank you. Well, I'm going to, first I'll preface this with a few disclaimers. Space Frontier Foundation obviously is not endorsing me. They don't have that ability, although if they did, they probably would. Thank you. And to the best of my ability, I will try to keep this about cheap access to space and keep the electoral politics of my district out of it. But don't hold it against me if that happens, because I am a politician. Sorry. One of the first things that I wanted to speak about is just take a moment and look at the semantics of the question that we're asking. What do we really mean by cheap? Cheap for who? Cheap for Boeing or cheap for you? What do we mean by access to space? Is it getting up there, the launch, the settlement? Very common, I find, is we're going through our discussions, we're talking about two completely different things. And so getting a definition of what is cheap. Is 50,000 kilograms for a dollar going to space, is that cheap, or is it 5,000? What do we really mean, and who is the audience that you're talking to? Now, from that, I really want to also give one last disclaimer, is that I'm here not to tell you what you should think, not to answer any of the questions, but to question all of the answers. And that's a really important thing that we need to look at for cheap access to space as well. Because things are relative. Access to space is cheaper now than it was, and we're going to want to keep continually making it cheaper and cheaper. Whatever it is now is going to become expensive compared to where we'd like to be. And that moves us into, you know, the questioning of the paradigms. And should cheap access to space be an American priority? And just for the spirit of argument, I'm going to say no. And that may sound counterintuitive, but you could really only have one priority. And that priority for America, for humanity, should not be cheap. It should be settlement. That should be the priority. That should be the goal, because when you make cheap the goal, there's a sacrifice. Are we sacrificing safety? You know, what is real the sacrifice that is in there? And we want cheap. I'm not saying that cheap is bad, but I want us to focus on, you know, what is the real goal here? What are we actually sacrificing? Because cheap access to space can mean the sacrifice is human settlement. It's much cheaper to put robots into space. It's much cheaper to build things into space. I mean, Made in Space has got a good thing going on. Put the manufacturing facilities up there. You know, that's a great point. So we really have to challenge that. And as you know, I've been talking with Sean. You know, another thing that we need to consider is it necessary to humiliate gravity, or do we just need to beat it? What is the big hurry? You know, stars aren't going anywhere. They've been there for billions of years. They'll still be there. Why do we need to get to space in a couple hours? What's wrong with getting there in a couple days? Can we sacrifice time to make space cheaper? I think that's really we need to be changing our perception to how we address some of these issues. Do we need to get to Mars in 5 months, in 2 months? Why can't we start sending raw supplies right now and catch up so it arrives so we get there the same time as our baggage does? You know, take 10 years to get there. It would be a lot cheaper. We need less fuel. What is the big hurry? And that takes us to another interesting point. What the big hurry is us. Humanity is going to continue. That's the goal. That's the goal of settlement. But what about me? Where do I come into this? And that's a big issue, and I think where my position comes into is how do we interact with the individuals, with the voters, you know, with the public? We need a public-private partnership. I'm all for NewSpace. I'm quite literally a child of NewSpace. I mean, many people here know my story, and I consider NewSpace like my big brother. Because I was quite literally raised in the back, you know, of rooms like this, and this is where I've come to. It's great to see, looking at the crowd, how many young people are in here. It's incredible with organizations like SEDS, and this is an important part, because I've had grandiose dreams of going to space my whole life, but I found, and I think as humanity does, at a certain point, I lost the vision of where I fit into that. And just like Esther is talking, we've said many times, how do we get people to see themselves in space? And that is another revolution that we need to look at. I offer the imagery and the vision of Mars needs farmers. That's something that's not so complex. Everybody can see that they can do that. And the truth is, as we've said, there was a great question a couple days ago on the panels about feeding ourselves and keeping ourselves healthy. One of the ways that we needed to diversify the movement is make space not just about rockets. We need to challenge those assumptions. And I think as we look at this cheap access to space, it's a good example. We keep looking and doing the same thing, and it keeps failing, because we're just like, how do we do it cheap? So we keep trying to make rockets look like airplanes. And because we're so concerned about making it cheap. If we are going to make it cheap, as we talked about in the paradigm discussion, you don't take it right on. You have to flank the idea. You've got to make another goal. I call it the Lego theory. You know, If you really want to find that Lego, you have to look for something else, and then you'll find that piece. That's what we need to do. And although creating a commercial space center out of KSC is my goal, because I think it would make access to space cheaper. Ultimately, I'm going to say the answer should be no. We should make settlement at any cost the priority. You can only have really one priority, and that should be human diversification throughout the cosmos. We need to have humans on other planets, and in some cases, it's difficult to bring other people into that. Especially as we have a growing movement within America itself of anti-science culture. That can be very difficult. How can you create that logical argument for people who think the planet's 6,000 years old? Well, can you really support space, and can those things really coexist together? Again, the answer is yes, but it changes. You have to change how you think about it. You have to speak, to the audience in the ways that they would understand, and that's where I think the things are really missing. We've got great engineers. We've got a robust commercial industry, but what we're lacking is the civil, the political, and the religious leadership. We need to get associations of pastors on board. We need to get people to understand that this is humanity's destiny. That to make the ties where religion does support our aspirations in space. So I am going to cut myself short because I'll never stop talking otherwise. And you get Charles back up here. Thank you.
So wonderful. So Gabriel answered the first question for the panel, and I'll give the opportunity for the others to ask it. It's why? Why cheap access space? So I'll just, to get in a little bit discussion here with Gabriel, it's like you don't get space settlement without cheap access space in my thinking. But he went directly like, you need to ask the next question, which is why cheap access to space? And he says space settlement, which is like at the foundation of the Space Frontier Foundation. It's about settling the solar system and the galaxy. But I want to open it up to our other panelists, and there's many whys, but I'd like to get their perspective. Do you agree with Gabriel? Do you disagree with them? Or do you have other answers for the why question? Thinking. Dan.
Actually, this is something that we've been talking about at the Space Portal for some time. And we've seen that there's actually, I think, really a hunger, even in Congress, to say, what is the overarching rationale for our space program? There was actually a recent testimony before Congress where that question came up several times. What is the overarching rationale? And so there are several of us who've been discussing this, and one that's a little broader than the one you mentioned that we like is using space to benefit humanity. And once you have that broad context, part of it is making humanity a multi-planet species, but another piece of it is then using space to benefit Earth. So the problems that we have here at Earth, can they be solved more readily by going to space? And so that's the one that we like. So using space to benefit humanity. And then that gives the context to why you want to have easy access to space and what you're going to be doing there and why you need to go there often. And if you're going there often, then it makes it much cheaper to build systems to get you there. So that's my answer.
Great. Sean?
And I was hoping that I would get to be the real controversial one up here, and I've been outmaneuvered, so...
Well, you got to now say something.
I got to up the ante. It's after lunch. It's Saturday. I will point out, by the way, the NewSpace guy is not wearing jeans, so I've been, again, outmaneuvered. So I think the answer to the question, first of all, Mastin is working to lower the barrier of access to space. If I was asked, should it be an American priority, it is an important thing, but lowering the barriers of access to space is not just price. And I've been saying this for quite some time. This is not simply a question of what's the dollar per pound to orbit. There's a lot of barriers to entry, and Price is one. Turn time, how long it takes between your launches, between the times you can get access, and programs like DCX, XS1, things like that, are going to lower other barriers besides just price. And I think that's extremely important.
Jeff, any thoughts on the why question?
Sure. On the question of why cheap access to space should be an American priority, well, Bill Gaubet said that, Jeff, you're too much of an engineer, you need to be more of a visionary. But unfortunately, I still kind of put it in pragmatic terms. The DoD and Space Command have come out and basically said that the fact that cost to get to space is essentially getting so high that our national security is essentially put at risk. The deepest pockets in the world, the U.S. government is finding themselves unable to really sustain the type of infrastructure they need to protect us, me, my family. So purely on that basis, I think it ought to be a national priority.
One of the related answers to the question of why, because we don't want to spend the money at the current price. The reason why cheap access is important is because we don't want to spend the money at the current rate. If we were willing to pay that price, and every entrepreneur that has an idea about a space idea could justify the value of their idea and say, yes, it's worth spending millions of dollars for me to put this thing up on orbit, then we wouldn't be talking about this. The whole why we need to reduce the price is because there's an assumption of that elasticity, and at some point, more people will use space because right now they just don't see the value. And so it is kind of flipping the question on its head. Why doesn't the U.S. government spend more money to put up more, why is it that we've decided culturally to put our money somewhere else? That's a little bit big question. Gabriel may be able to answer that one when he gets up to Congress to help people change how much we want to pay for these things. In the meantime, since I can't change the macro, the best I can do is focus on trying to change the micro.
But I'm going to be controversial here since Sean
Thank
wants
you.
some controversy. Sean, you're avoiding the question. You are motivated by cheap access to space personally. Why is it important? Why is it important to you?
It's important to me because
It's not about these other things. What is, like, you committed your life to this. What is it?
because I believe, it'll make me take the vision stance here, I believe that space is one of those domains that it has the opportunity to cross over from a room full of experts to the general population. Computers used to be the domain of people with pocket protectors and thick rim glasses that sat back in the corner, and it's now mainstream. The whole idea of internet in your pocket, I mean, the younger folks here don't realize this is actually kind of a huge change. Green tech used to be the domain expertise of ponytail guys that, well, they weren't in an office, they were out, climbing in the trees and living off the land. And the idea of sustainability made a transition from domain experts, the same hippies that talked about it in the 60s and the 70s, then it got to a point where it was able to transition over, and it crossed over into the mainstream. And I believe space is a domain that has that same opportunity, that it's going to go from the experts and the people who owned it and held it closely, and as the price comes down, you can draw more people in. You can draw in folks that aren't 20-year experts in space, and you can find applications, and you're making me make the argument of if you build it, they will come, and I hate that because that is a terrible business plan, but it is what I believe, that as we lower that barrier, there will be more uses and more application.
But you hate the argument, you don't think it's effective, but you believe it, because you believe you committed your life here, you're going to make a difference, right?
Yes.
Yes. So, okay, next question. So, does anybody want to build off any of that? Or?
let me just say that I think you're right. There are a number of, important changes happening right now relative to technology. Actually, I first got this argument from Jeff Greason about why is space available now to the common man where it wasn't maybe even 15 years ago, okay? And I have to say, I had a chance to work at SpaceX for about a year, okay? And I'm sure that they work similar to how Maston works. And the impact that Google and McMaster are having on the ability to do serious space hardware cannot be overstated. The ability to hear an idea of a technology, get on Google, find out about it, find the experts working it, make contact with them, decide if you want to use it or not, work up a design, get on McMaster, order the parts, have them arrive the next day or maybe 2 days, and put a prototype together and test it to see if it will work or not. That's completely alien to the way aerospace used to be, and I think Jeff can attest to this. When I first got into this field, you were probably looking at least months, if not in some cases years, okay, to actually prototype new ideas and new technologies, okay? And Jeff Greason was saying that, it used to be that you had to have these large entities, large aerospace entities, because you needed the deep expertise, you needed the big, warehouses with all the specialized parts and components. You needed to have the experts for doing very complex design on very complex systems. And now these things are really accessible on a much smaller scale and a much smaller timeline. And it's really, I think, making space then accessible to this whole DIY, do-it-yourself world. And CubeSats, Bob Twiggs at Stanford, put in place this form factor, which he actually put in place for teaching. He actually didn't intend it to be a usable spacecraft. It was supposed to be a teaching tool. If it's small enough that you can use for classes, okay, that was beneficial. And now we're finding, because of micro-miniaturization, you can do more and more serious work. And Planet Labs is showing that you can make an incredible business out of it. So we're seeing things change, and now this is opening up, I think, to a whole new area of investigation and activity. And again, that's the critical part to get the cost down, is that you have to have a reason to go. You have to engage the people who will want to go, who will pay the price because the prices are low enough and the technology is accessible enough that they want to go. And then that changes, in my opinion, everything.
So Dan, you jumped on the next question, which is, we've had 40 years of attempts, and as I laid out at the start of this discussion, they failed. What is different now, or what should we do different now based on the lessons learned of the last several national attempts of this that have failed? What have you learned? What do we should do different, or what is different now that we can succeed? So
I'll take a crack at that. Let's see. Let's count them. Shuttle, NASP, X-33. I guess are three that come to mind. And I think in all three of those instances, you have to look at the technology readiness at the time of those systems were initiated. At the time of the shuttle, the high-performance LOX hydrogen engines did not exist. The thermal protection system did not exist. I mean, let alone try to figure out how to refurbish those things. How do you even get them to work in the first place and get them and field them on a system as critical as something that carries a man? Same thing with NASP, trying to use an air breather to get to space. You've got to have turbo machinery to get you going up to speeds to turn on the air breather, and then air breathers don't work so great in space, so I need a third engine. And now I've just tripled the most complex system on my vehicle. I just don't get it. X-33 and a single stage to orbit. One of the things that I led at McDonnell Douglas was the objective system. Essentially, I was the guy in the back room trying to make the math add up to make single stage to orbit possible. And going through all of the scaling relationships. One of the things I did learn, though, is that the scaling relationship says Single stage to orbit is possible. The only question is, how big does the vehicle have to be? And you need a lot of advanced technology to get the vehicle down to a practical size. You need to look at, and there's examples just laying in front of us, of evolutionary approaches that need to be taken to this problem, not revolutionary approaches. You've got an expendable two-stage system that's we know how to operate very well now. Okay, now you want to improve that system and bring the cost down. All right. We know that 80% of the cost of an expendable vehicle is essentially in the hardware that you're throwing away. Okay, so let's try to reuse part of it. Well, what's the easiest thing to try to reuse? Well, let's try to use the first stage. Let's take one step, okay? Then get comfortable with how to do that, and then we'll take the next step, an evolutionary approach as opposed to a revolutionary approach.
Others? Gabriel?
Yeah, so I've been daydreaming, so this may not even be on the on that question. But I realized that there was another answer that I neglected to question when I was up and speaking, and it goes to, again, reimagining what it is we're trying to do, and it touches a lot on some other issues that we've seen of continually trying to recreate things that we did in another place. And so right now, one of the biggest things that is fueling the cost of going to space is all this stuff we're bringing with us and what we're trying to do when we're up there. We are trying to make being in space as much like being on Earth as possible. And that is the, as Heinlein said, like sending water bags around, in space. It's not very practical. We need to, and I think Larry Osborne yesterday said something that really touched me with how the work that they're doing so one person can control multiple drones. And as we want humans in space, but if we're making cost a priority in doing so, we have to look at ways that we can sacrifice other things. And so one place I think we need to reimagine that is, do we need to create an artificial environment like we have on Earth in space, or are there other ways to get us up there? Can we keep people in a conscious but stasis position and allow them to control the robotics that they have? In which case, one person can be controlling a fleet of semi-autonomous robots. They can be getting way more done with far less resources, and especially as we move towards the longer missions. It's all the stuff that you need to bring with you just gets immense. I think somebody at the 100-Year Starship Symposium a couple of years ago, he tried to show everybody, to quantify it, how many truckloads of things that you would need to support one person, over, in an interstellar vision. So that's another place where I think we have to really take a step back to see the bigger perspective of what we're doing and continually to challenge ourselves and all of our assumptions of what it needs to be like to get the job done. And in the end, perhaps by those savings, those early savings, we can get to that point where we can have the high frontier colonies. But in the meantime, we need to do something much more radical and visionary to get that job done.
Okay. Well, great. We always should challenge our assumptions, and that's where a lot of innovation comes. Jeff's in the back of the room, Jeff Grace, and I've heard him say if he could launch half a person to 100 kilometers, he'd figure out a way to do it. So that's great thinking, always a great thing. I want to open it up to the audience for your questions or thoughts for the panelists on this, and please make it a speech and put it in the form of a question if you could, and have a conversation. So who would like to come up? Please introduce yourself.
I'm the tall guy in I'm David Alexander. I'm the director of the Rice Space Institute. And I guess in listening to the conversation, I wanted to sort of take a little crack at reconciling the yes answers to the no answers, and I think that it fits, and I'd like to hear the response. I think one of the main reasons for having cheap access to space as a priority is that it opens up space to innovation. A lot of the things we've heard about at this conference and a lot of the things that people are doing here would not have thought or dreamed of doing it if it was going to cost what it's traditionally cost us to get into space. But at the same, so that's the overriding thing. But at the same time, what we're really talking about is cheap access to low Earth orbit, because we're trying to bring more people into the space conversation, not just as astronauts, but as users of space resources and space data, and that's what a lot of these companies are doing. The next stage is cheap access to the moon and cheap access to Mars or whatever. And that's, I think, while there are some really innovative ideas from the private sector, that's where you forget about the cheap and you think about how to make that doable, so that we have an environment in which the innovation can occur further away from low Earth orbit. And so there is some purpose to what you're saying, and I think there's a lot of real reasons for what everyone else is saying, and I'd just like to hear what the panel's comments are on that ecosystem that we're trying to develop.
Let's, if you have any thoughts, try to keep them short, because we'll get more questions.
I agree. I think the ecosystem is key. And again, it's not just the price. Because if I can give you a launch, but it's 10 years from now, then you can't innovate. You can't turn that. You can't. So it's not strictly price. Price is important, but it's not the only metric.
Yes. No, I'll give you an example. Nanoracks, which I'm the co-founder of, it's not just the price they deliver to a nanosat out the airlock, it's the fact that you can sign a contract and do it in maybe around 9 months. So that's there's many other things. So, Al, oh, it's Jeff. Jeff.
I'll be brief. A question I was surprised we didn't reach was, if cheap access to space should be a priority for the United States, what should we do about it? And the reason I want to set that question is, a lot of the efforts that you mentioned in the past were predicated on the hypothesis that access to space was a technology problem. And I think the recent developments are showing rather strongly that it's not a technology problem, it's a business problem. So that's why the technology solutions, in my view, don't address the problem. So if we should be doing something about cheap access to space as a nation, and it's not a technology problem, what should we do?
Great question, Jeff. So, Dan.
Let me jump in on that. I'll give you two acronyms, COTS and CRS. So the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program, and then the Commercial Resupply Services Program. And these are the two programs NASA put in place that essentially stood up SpaceX and now the Orbital Antares. And they should be a model that the government is using in a whole series of different things that we're doing in space. There's actually a report that's soon going to be issued identifying 10 areas, 10 that the agency has identified that should be good candidates for using essentially a COT-CRS model. And again, it's a proven model, and I think that's the biggest thing we could do to really accelerate space development.
Great. Any others adds on that? So I'll just, since I've spoken on this before, I'll say I'm absolutely agree that it's a demand problem, that if we had clear, proven, absolutely certain demand for 100 flights a year, more for anybody who could do this, there would be a lot more business cases closed, and the X-37 has proved that we can do a reusable Mach 25 vehicle, and so it's much more a business case problem than it ever has been before. So, Al.
Two questions. They're for different people, and it'll be obvious. The first is I read an article about the video that SpaceX had, the semi-water landing, and it said that, I don't know if it's true, but they did say that SpaceX expected that they would require no refurbishment, just refueling. I want to know if that's true, and if so, why you think so. But let me get the other question out so I don't have to stand here. And the other thing is, Congress has been enormously helpful to what we want to do. It's provide billions and billions and billions of dollars, but they could be more helpful. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about why. How?
Okay, well, on the first one, what SpaceX hopes to do is to do essentially just a quick inspection, and then refuel and go. They don't know until they get the vehicle back. That's why they've been struggling for a couple of years now to get a vehicle back and see what damage has been done. Of course, they'd love to get it back and not have it quenched in salt water, okay, which is going to make it a mess. But even getting one quenched in salt water would be hugely useful to really analyze and see where they're at and what systems may need to be changed. But they eventually want to get to essentially aircraft refuel and refly it. That's their desire.
That makes sense.
Okay. This young lady.
Hi, I'm Cece Aniston from the International Space University. I was wondering, you're talking about cheap access to space. In order for that to actually become reality, first of all, you need to have a reason to go there and to go there often. And also, I think it was Sean who was talking about actually the idea of mainstreaming space. So I think in order for both of those things to happen, it has to become an international phenomenon. It can only be an American thing. And at the moment, it feels like most of the commercial space industry is in America. Do you take actions, or do you have interest in how much in international cooperation? Because, like I said, in order for those things to happen, you have to get Europe and other countries as well interested. And not only talking about getting payloads and maybe some few passengers from Europe, but actually supporting the European commercial space industry as well.
So the good news is it's not a technology problem to communicate around the world. It is not a technology problem. It really is a problem of the infrastructure. We have our favorite acronym of ITAR. Basically, as a small company, I'm petrified, and maybe overly so, of interacting outside the U.S. The barrier for a small company is pretty high, and if I'm not careful, I wind up stepping afoul of things. But yes, we absolutely, I don't necessarily care where my customers are coming from. I want to help create that value. There's some barriers of entry there in the legal system.
Charles, can I answer Al's second question real quick? And that is, how can we make Congress more proactive? And the answer is, the NewSpace movement. It comes from the people. There's a big problem in America to assign blame. When you assign blame, you remove responsibility for your own actions. And it really begins with the people in this room. One thing that I love about Houston is almost every time I go to a space conference, there are publicly elected officials at the city level, the local level from Houston who are there. It's one of the things that inspired me to run. I went to a conference and I was like, there is nobody from Florida here. What is going on? And that's what got me up. And so if we want to increase this, I'll take a shameless plug, help me, but go back, where you're from, run for office, make space an issue. And that's what this is all about. I mean, I have a very tough odds. I'll be the first one to tell you this isn't going to be easy to do by any means, but we have to make it a challenge. And you've got to put it to the people. In this midterm election, I hope that America will think a lot about space, because they're going to hear about this race. There's many interesting things that this race is going to come up and be a national press for. And so we have to make it an issue, make it a public issue again, because we're missing that. And so do it at home.
How many people here have spoken to your representatives, staffer on space issues?
Raise your hands. How many have done it in the last 2 years?
As long as you're an American citizen, even if you're not, it should be every single one of us.
It's not really as big and scary as it sounds. Seriously, pick up the phone and go, hey, who on the staff covers space issues? And then great, just tell them a story about what you're doing, 2 or 3 minutes, and then you're at least putting space on their radar. I know it sounds like, oh, I'm just one little person, but let me tell you, the actual act of calling will make a difference. I'm seeing it happen, so please do it.
I think this is a good point. This asteroids bill that just came out, it was proposed by the person I'm running against. And he's been there for 5 years. with the opportunity to propose legislation like this. But it is not until I qualified for the ballot and making space my predominant issue that we saw action. So whether or not I get elected to this seat, we're already seeing how the democratic process is still alive, it's working, because we force accountability for people's actions. They will come to the table. And that's also, I think it's a good plug for March Storm 2015.
That's well, on that subject, Gabriel mentioned that for those who want to take action and responsibility and make a difference and jump in and have an opportunity to have your voice heard, the Space Frontier Foundation is starting up its March Storm project, which is advocating a citizen space agenda. It's an organized attempt at starting next March to lobby the Congress again. It actually created the first funding for the X-33 and passed the Commercial Space Act of 1998. For those of you who are interested, you could come up to me, give me your card, or you can go in the display area. There's a booth for March Storm. You can sign up to get more information and to be invited to the next March Storm by the Space Frontier Foundation. So, so Hannah, this is the last question. This is it, and we'll keep it short, please.
I did want to say that killing people does cost. You can time costs. They cost a lot. So if you can use something a lot, you can bring the cost down. There are a lot of projects, mining asteroids, the moon, settling. I want to go to Mars and settle. I want to open up the space for mankind. But I was really encouraged when you're saying you might have more than one stage. I don't care if it's 10 stages. If you can hardly bring the stages back together and snap it and reuse it, it's great. I was really upset when I heard about the NASP, the National Aerospace Plane, and the other projects. I got even more frustrated when I heard that because it couldn't get more than Mach 18 or something, it was going to be dropped. They would have been great first stages.
Oh, great,
And
great.
There's
and they would have brought the cost down.
there are a lot of costs. He brings up the point that
It's got
cost.
to be robust and quick to reuse.
A cost is not just the dollar figure on the check that you write. And there's a lot of costs than this making space less expensive. It's reducing uncertainty. It's reducing risk. It's reducing time.
Yes. Jeff, last short remark and.
Yeah, just a quick short remark. A couple things on how you can actually help us. I truly believe XS1 is the right next step to take. And the thing that you can help us do is help the government crystallize on really what should the capability requirement be. That would help. And number two is help us make sure that we don't get any extraneous requirements creep into the program, that this thing stays focused on essentially doing what the government does well, helping reduce risk, whether it be the railroads, whether it be aviation, access to space.
All right. Thank you. Thanks to our.
Thank you, Charles, for moderating. So during this networking break in the San Jose room is Dan Curry, a veteran of over 100 feature films and television shows that have won 7 Emmys and other awards.
His legacy in terms of promoting reusable space has been very important to pushing the industry forward. And unfortunately, he passed away a couple of weeks ago. Former boss of mine, certainly a visionary, but his legacy fortunately lives on. Okay, so one of the big bottlenecks we have, certainly in many of the activities that I've witnessed in presentations, is being able to utilize space. And one of the big bottlenecks, of course, in being able to utilize space is the fact that it's so expensive to get there. So what DARPA has done is they have conceived of a program in the same vein as the Delta Clipper to produce a highly reusable system, this time a 2-stage system, and demonstrate that you can very efficiently operate a rocket-powered vehicle, airline-like operations, something you often hear, and marry the reusability in a high-performance vehicle and demonstrate that you can turn it around quickly. Okay, so what technologies are required to be able to implement such a vehicle? Well, you certainly need to be able to fly the booster autonomously in an unmanned fashion. You need precision, guidance, navigation, and control. Being able to land on a carrier certainly doesn't hurt. You need to be able to fabricate and operate reusable spaceplane airframes and integrate the proper propulsion systems. You need very highly efficient cryogenic propellant tanks, such as composite common bulkhead sandwich tanks. You need very high thrust to weight propulsion, and there's a lot of good solutions out there.
Good afternoon. Our next session is on cheap access to space. Cheap access is has been and is going to become a major strategic priority for the Space Frontier Foundation. The foundation led the public campaign in the 1990s for cheap access to space when the heyday of the X-33 and the X-37 and military spaceplane and DCX. The history is that the foundation actually cut the deal to save the DCX program by moving it over from SDIO to NASA, cut a deal with Dan Golden, made a strategic choice of instead of attacking the space station, the deal with Dan Golden, if you save DCX and keep it flying, the foundation would stop trying to kill the space station. For some period of years, cheap access became the #1 strategic space policy priority in this community. The history of this, though, is that there is many failures of attempts at cheap access from the original shuttle, worked operationally but failed, to the NASA program in the 80s, spent several $billions, and it was many billions of dollars and 6 miracle technologies away from succeeding. Then to the X-33 program with VentureStar failed. And then there was actually a 4th attempt that in the mid-00s was an attempt to put together a big, huge government initiative, and it collapsed to, instead they did the Vision for Space Exploration. So we have a panel of experts on cheap access to space here that represents both civil experts as well as commercial experts, and a candidate for U.S. Congress from the 8th District of Florida who has some as well. And then to Sean's right, we have Jeff Lane, who's the program manager at Northrop Grumman's XS1 program. And Jeff has 30 years experience, and his background, for those of you, some of you were there, he was on the DCX program at McDonnell Douglas and has deep expertise in hypersonics and reusable launch vehicles, and now is managing Northrop's development project for XS1. And so we're going to first have Jeff up to share some thoughts and go through them, and then we'll have a conversation. Jeff Lane.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Aaron, for the invitation to speak today. So if we could cue up the disc. The title of the presentation is Cheap Access to Space, the Past, Present, and Future, packed into about 10 minutes, as I promised to keep it short. Next chart, please. The history is certainly a matter of perspective. Actually, you went one too far here. Let's go back. Okay. This particular vehicle is actually a vehicle that was developed by Phil Bono as a part of the NASA Saturn derivative studies. And it's kind of the starting point that I chose for talking about the past relative to reusable space. This is the Ithacus vehicle, essentially a derivative of a single-staged orbit vehicle. This particular vehicle was antipodal range vehicle to reach anywhere in the world with a single stage. And the reason I bring this up is basically in the early 90s, SDIO came out with a requirement as part of the SDI program.
Policy expertise and thinking in this area. Today, I want to briefly introduce each of the of our panelists. We're going to have a short briefing from each of them, remarks, and then we're going to have a conversation among the group. Our first panelist, so I'm going to go actually, I'll do Jeff last. So our Gabriel Rothblatt from the 8th District of Florida. He's a candidate, he's a Democratic candidate running against Congressman Bill Posey, and he represents the nation's premier launch site, and we'll get his thoughts and thinking. Dr. Dan Rasky here, he's the director of the Space Portal and the Emerging Space Office at NASA Ames, and has worked on various cheap access to space initiatives. He's a national expert in thermal protection systems, and so that was many programs and activities. He's contributed expertise in that. He's been acknowledged of helping out SpaceX with their TPS, and has several objects, I think, in the Air and Space Museum and Smithsonian that he's worked on. To his right is Sean Mahoney, CEO of Maston Space Systems. Maston is one of the 3 winners of the Phase 1 DARPA Access 1 contracts that just got announced a few weeks ago. And if you don't, the Access 1 program from DARPA is a concept of 10-10-10, which is Mach 10 times 10 days, at least once to Mach 10. And they're starting the first Phase 1 is study contracts. Northrop, Boeing, and Maston were the prime winners. Also Virgin Galactic, X-Corps, and Blue Origins are participating team members too. And we're going to hear from Sean about Maston's thinking and his ideas about cheap access to space.
To put up a whole myriad of satellites called Brilliant Pebbles and Brilliant Eyes, and they needed a low-cost method of getting those satellites into orbit. We're talking hundreds of satellites. So McDonnell Douglas went back and essentially dug up the material associated with this vehicle. But there was a major problem in one of the requirements of that is that the vehicle needed to have a high cross range. The Air Force wanted a once-around capability flying south out of Vandenberg. This particular vehicle, L/D, is very low, on the order of 0.3, and has very low cross-range capability. Well, it turns out in the late 70s, early 80s, actually another program that I was fortunate to be a part of called AMARV, Advanced Maneuvering Reentry Vehicle. We were testing this in the late 70s, early 80s to essentially demonstrate the ability to be able to have a vehicle that could evade an adversary's ballistic missile defense system. And through flight test, we're able to demonstrate extreme high L/Ds, and in fact, L/Ds high enough to essentially provide the cross range that was necessary. So McDonnell Douglas's answer to addressing the SDIO problem was a vertical takeoff, vertical landing, nose first reentry called the DC-1. And as a part of that program, McDonnell Douglas proposed a ground test demonstrator to actually produce a flight vehicle to demonstrate that you could operate in subscale a liquid hydrogen rocket-powered vehicle in a reusable manner and operate it in a fully reusable manner and operate it very routinely. And you can't really talk about the DCX program without talking about Bill Galbatz. Certainly,